All right, we're going to get started. It's about 10:15. Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for joining us today for Data Disruption and Defense, a collaborative approach to cybersecurity in academic libraries. My name is Roger Strong. I'm the Vice President for Academic Sales Americas at Gale Cengage. And I'll let my colleagues introduce themselves.
I guess I'm up first.
Yep.
Let's see. Can you hear me out there? Okay. Hey, everybody. I'm John Feltz. I'm the head of I'm the head of collections and information technology at University Libraries at Coastal Carolina University. And I have been a librarian for over 30 years now, and I'm currently a member of Seamless Access, as well as the SNSI Security Initiative.
Good morning, everyone. I was not prepared to introduce myself. Now I got to remember what I do. I'm Mike Meth, right there on the right. I'm the Dean of the Library at San Jose State University. I'm also the Interim Dean of the College of Information, Data, and Society, which some of you might know because you might be graduates from the SJSUI school. And I'm glad to be here on this panel. Good morning.
I feel like I'm on a Senate committee hearing panel here. Okay. Hi, good morning. My name is Matthew Argucci. I'm the Director of Product Marketing at Wiley. I was a librarian by pedigree, but I've been on the publisher side for about 10 years now. And I'm also a member of the Scholarly Network Security Initiative with John, which you'll hear a little bit more about today.
Great. Thanks, all. So today, the format we're going to have is a little bit different. We instead of us getting up and lecturing to you, we thought it would be good to have sort of a question and answer. So we've framed some questions which we think you all may want to ask around cybersecurity in academic libraries and at your information organizations. And we'll have the folks on the panel answer them. We do encourage you throughout the session, not just at the end, but if you do have a question, I believe we'll have someone roaming with a mic. So we encourage you to ask those questions or maybe a follow-up to what you're hearing up here. But we will leave time for questions at the end. So with that, just a reminder about the Code of Conduct at Charleston. I think most people are familiar with that, but wanted to remind folks on that. So before we get started, we thought it would be good to sort of provide a framing slide for context. And up here, you'll see a number of news stories, some of which may be familiar to you, some libraries or organizations that have experienced cyber attacks in the past couple years. And but by no means is this the least of those stories or institutions that you've probably seen or heard or maybe experienced yourself. I think the most important couple of things for framing that we wanted to point out to you at the bottom, a couple key points. So at Cengage, we actually track from a cybersecurity perspective encountered cyber attacks. And last quarter with Cengage, we encountered about 8.2 billion cyber attacks in our quarter. All of those were mitigated thanks to our privacy security teams, but I'm sure many of you within knowledge organizations are facing those same sort of concerns with cyber attacks. The other stat there is from Checkpoint Research, where in 2023, there were over 2,500 cyber attacks on average in the education research space. And I'm sure that may be equivalent to what we're maybe seeing this year. We'll see what the stats look like at the end of the year, but that is a lot of cyber attacks. And then 1.14 million, this is just an example of the ransom a leading US medical research institution paid to hackers to resolve a ransomware attack a few years ago. And finally, within the last few years, about 144 universities hacked by Iran's Mabna Institute, along with 176 other universities from around the world. So by no means is this there are many more stats than this, but we thought that this would be good for framing in our discussion today. So with that, the first question, why has there been a marked increase in recent cyber attacks on higher education knowledge institutions? And I'll direct this to John to start the question.
Sure. Thank you, Richard. I certainly there's no one reason why we're seeing such an uptick in cybersecurity incidents, especially in higher education and knowledge institutions. The whole confluence of events have come together, seems like simultaneously in a way, given the number of phishing and other cybersecurity attacks that have occurred recently in the last couple of years. I would attribute it to a few things, although certainly not a completely comprehensive list of things that have occurred. But I think that higher ed, we're seeing just in general as sort of a soft target. We have historically underfunded cybersecurity efforts. Just they're not seen as a priority on a lot of campuses, and there's no problem unless there's a problem, and then, oh boy, we got a big problem, right? I think that's a consideration, as well as I think we're seen as a target-rich environment as well. I mean, we have loads of personally identifiable information that's pretty easily available if you know how to get to it. And there's publishers' assets and their research assets that everybody wants to get access to through Sci-Hub and other shadow organizations. So when you think about that, academic institutions many times will use new untested technologies, given that our cybersecurity efforts are underfunded writ large, but we also maintain legacy hardware and software many times. And I think they have extended well past their shelf life and their warranty dates. So sort of a paradox there occurring at once. Also, it's something I didn't know until I kind of dug into it a little bit, but attackers apparently really value email addresses that end in .edu. I wasn't quite sure what the reasons were on that, so I did a little bit of digging, so you might have found other information, but one scenario that occurs somewhat frequently is that a lot of researchers apparently wear dual hats, as we know, at their universities and for various military, industrial, and defense contractors. And cyber attackers find it a lot easier to first compromise someone in the education sector and then sort of hopscotch or leapfrog to use that access to more convincingly phish somebody in the military or defense industry who are considered a higher value target. So, in my opinion, and lastly, it's just based on my 30 years of working in various universities and various academic libraries, it just seems like most academic staff were not really well trained at all. Not a lot of information comes to us about cybersecurity efforts or best practices to avoid becoming a target. And yet, I think we're also exposed to the most phishing attacks. For instance, just one quick anecdote, and then I'll promise I'll shut up. At my university, the accounts payable department was hit with a phishing attack. And well, I guess it was successful in terms of the cyber attackers, but it sure wasn't for the university. And it cost us in the range of 6 figures. And I can't believe I'm saying this, but 1 week later it happened again, and it was another 6 figures. So I think the response to that is training, good information, and persistent, consistent engagement with your faculty and staff to avoid these types of scenarios.
Thanks, John. Mike, anything to add to that from your perspective?
I think John really, in many ways, summed it up. But when you look at some of the attacks that happened, for example, on the British Library, which was on the opening slide, they wrote a pretty extensive report trying to detail what happened and why it happened and how it could have happened. And a couple of things stand out, which is one, they still really don't know how exactly it happened. But it is a combination of legacy systems that they believe that they maintained. And I think that's one of the things we need to ask ourselves and our institutions, amongst other responsibilities of who's really responsible for cybersecurity ultimately, but also like which one of our systems are legacy in a way that could be exploited, and understand that. And I believe, as we all know, our institutions are a hodgepodge of systems, sometimes in the library, sometimes around campus. And so I think there's another opportunity there that hackers love to exploit.
Yeah, good point. And I know with the British Libraries you mentioned, I mean, it's one of Gale's larger publishing partners, and it affects us too as those things happen in terms of being able to adapt and overcome from a publishing standpoint. So thank you. Next question, which is, we'll kick it back to Michael again. What types of information assets can be at risk when you think about those information assets?
Yeah. So John started talking about this a little bit already, but the obvious stuff that we keep in our databases on our clients, patrons, scholars, whatever you want to call them. So email accounts, you already heard why they might be of interest. Addresses, phone numbers, birth dates often are included as well, but also student IDs, employee IDs, and possibly even financial information in some cases. So maybe somebody paid a fine and there's a credit card information or something like that on the account. So that's one set of personally identifiable information that certainly we have plenty. We have usually pretty strong privacy protections in libraries, and we also try to scrub many of the histories of loan data, et cetera, but nonetheless, there are snapshots in time that can be taken. And then there's also the larger question about institutional assets, such as related to research, some of the digitized work that we have. We talked a little bit already about why budget information could be of interest, because then it leads to possibly creating fake invoices or other things that could be paid. And then there's, of course, you mentioned as it affects the publishers, your assets, your licensed content. And I'm sure many of us have over the years gotten those. You've downloaded too much from your organization. We're going to turn off your access and now get back into compliance so we can get it fixed. But I would also say that when we talk about the idea of information and assets, that there's a conversation or a notion around, there's a continuum, as I see it, of cybersecurity. So there's like the what I would call the slightly more innocuous but maybe embarrassing things that happen, such as when the president sends an email that a faculty member is retiring and a grand piano is available to anybody who wants it. I see you've received those too. It's amazing. Which, it leads to personal embarrassment and maybe a small financial loss in most cases before people get wise to the idea that they've been compromised. And, true story, it happens. But then you also have the more vicious and substantial attacks. The British Library, as I mentioned previously, was attacked in 2023. If you go to the website right now, they're still not fully restored. The Toronto Public Library was attacked. They're still not fully restored. Calgary Public Library was recently attacked. And there's an interesting thing on that when we think about also who then in this conversation, who, like as I mentioned just a second ago, is responsible. So is it the individual who provides possibly like a compromised entry? Is it the campus in our cases, right? So often, because campus IT often runs our networks and manages the domains at the top level. Is it our vendor partners, through the many different systems that we integrate and how it all goes into the library stack? And right, like we don't own our LMS or our circ systems. Like all of that is managed through others. Are they hosted through cloud, or are we doing some on-prem stuff? So really, there's a lot of different ways that we can look at how assets could be at risk. But at the end of the day, when I look at this question, I think the other part that is probably the biggest asset at risk is actually the interruption that a cyber attack causes, the loss of access to resources, the way that the university or the library or whoever, again, is in charge of it has to come together and develop a whole plan to rebuild a system, in some cases from scratch, because some of these legacy systems, as you know, that we maintain, they're no longer supported, which is often also the entry point for security breaches. Or for the researcher who needs access to resources and can't get them now, the deadlines that are being missed. So there's really a very large conversation on that continuum of impact that, again, it goes from like maybe you personally are experiencing it or somebody in your organization to all the way out to, the entire institution. And one last thing I'll say on that is when we really talk about that, not to be, too crass, but if you're a part of different consortia, now the consortium is affected. And so somebody in a conversation I had last week said something to the effect, if any part of my network, the social network, the community networks that he's part of lowers their cybersecurity, their security settings, it actually weakens the entire system. So I always think of it a little bit like, if there's a crack in the wall somewhere, then there's a crack in the wall, and then it provides that entry point. So really, there's a lot of personal responsibility that we have, but then there's also this next level of understanding how our decisions could impact others.
Yeah, thanks. And the consortia piece is an interesting one, I think, because I think it's probably, as we think about whether we're vendors or libraries and having those conversations with our consortia partners is, what are those mitigating things that we need to look at, for some of those risks. So good point. John, anything to add to that you would say?
No, I just thought that was a really good point, that typically in this interconnected environment in which we all work and live in, if it affects one person or one institution or one situation, one environment, it affects all of us in some way, either directly or indirectly. So thank you for sharing that.
Great, thanks. So the next question, which we'll direct to Matt, is what role do content providers, library vendors play in mitigating risk? Matt, what do you think?
That's a great question. I'm going to say this twice to make sure that it really resonates, because I firmly believe that cybersecurity is a shared responsibility. Cybersecurity is a shared responsibility.
Could you share that one more time?
Yeah.
Say it again.
Yeah. And so John and Mike were just talking about the user and personal identifying information that are at risk when there are cybersecurity incursions. And certainly on the content provider side, we take that incredibly seriously. We have not only a moral and ethical obligation to protect user data as stewards of that data, but also legal ones as well, right? There's legislation like GDPR that ensure privacy, but also making sure that we don't fall victim to phishing attacks where that information is taken and then shared by the bad actors that are out there. So we do have robust security teams, and we go through our own fire drills as well to make sure that us as employees aren't giving away that information or falling victims to attack. As you might have guessed, as content providers, we are also very interested in protecting content and copyrighted material as well. And John was speaking earlier to the fact that there's that universities and higher education and research institutions are target-rich environment, and while we certainly house user information or personally identifying information, the larger target for content providers is content. And there are different vectors for trying to get at that, right? So the bad actors that want to take content, they could come at content providers directly, but often what we're seeing is that they're trying to go through institutions as well, because to the first question earlier about why are institutions so heavily targeted, and so much of that has to do with the user population, right? You have huge swaths of, I don't mean this in a diminishing way, but uneducated users who aren't educated in the ways of cybersecurity and have their credentials stolen through a phishing attack. So I think that there's an opportunity to work together to help educate, and I'll talk about the Scholarly Network Security Initiative in a minute, but to also realize how disruptive these incidents, the impact that they have, not only on content providers, but on institutions, right? I think that there are long-term and short-term consequences to when there is a perceived cybersecurity breach that exists, whenever credentials get stolen, or Mike, you were saying earlier, you get a rap on the knuckles to say you've been downloading, too quickly. We need to adjust that or address that, because the short-term effects, I think that, in many cases, content providers have robust cybersecurity measures or abuse monitoring systems that shut off access when a certain threshold has been reached. And of course, these things happen at like the worst possible time, in the middle of midterms or finals, or in the middle of an information literacy session, right? And that's incredibly disruptive. And I think that as content providers, we need to acknowledge that. But there are also long-term consequences to this as well. So, and there are incidences where there are sort of spikes in usage. They create the sense of inflation in usage data and the counter reports, for example, that aren't real. And in collection development decisions, having those statistics that are supporting, for renewing resources, having accurate data is important. And so content providers, I think, also have a responsibility to try to segment that usage or false usage in cases where there's abuse. But it happens regularly. There was an incident a few years ago that I lovingly call Cloudflare Gate, where easy proxy traffic was being perceived as an abusive measure of downloading when in fact it was legitimate. So really what's required here, I think, in that sense of shared responsibility is collaboration and working together, not just with libraries, because incident response is also a shared responsibility, but also technology providers and vendors too. I don't know if there's anyone from OCLC in the crowd, but Easy Proxy is such a popular tool for authentication, but in those cases where an entire IP is shut down, as I mentioned, that's disruptive. But they've developed a new product called, or a feature called the Anonymous Identifier, where if there's a perceived abuse incident, that that particular user is shut off as opposed to the entire IP. That requires, configuration and integration, but that also requires content providers and entities, authentication entities like OCLC, but also, seamless access and GetFTR. I think, not to go too far off on a tangent here, but a lot of the shadow organizations that exist and sort of are siphoning content, the raison d'etre is because of the friction that users face when accessing licensed content. So if we can be working together to kind of eliminate some of that friction for access, I think that is also a means in which we can, we'll see a mitigation of cybersecurity in the long term. But again, it's collaboration, collaboration, collaboration. It is a shared responsibility, and we need to be working together. And I think there's a question a little bit later, which I can dive into.
Great.
Oh, and sorry, I'd be remiss if, Roger, I didn't ask you, because you were also a content provider on this stage, if you had anything to add.
Well, I think that you mentioned usage, and I think it's very important. I think, at least from a customer-facing perspective for content providers, right? Oftentimes, the products that we set up are through IP authentication. Otherwise, it's important for us as content providers to understand how those setups need to work, whether there's a campus abroad, whether you're providing alumni access, all of those different elements. And every library is different, every institution is different. And I think if we're not doing those things, then when the time comes where there is an incident, we'll be in a much better position to respond to that. I think the other thing is the transparency, the communication with our library partners, and that's around, if we do see that usage spike, which I know we've had cases of that we're working with them to identify, and our tech team's working with them to identify, okay, is this valid usage, as Matt alluded to earlier, or is it something that we really need to understand and shut off temporarily and do an investigation and come back? So I think those are a couple of the things from our perspective, but I think I agree with what Matt said with his comments there. This is around, what steps should libraries take to mitigate these risks? I know we've touched on it a little bit, but I'll kick it to John to talk a little bit about, what does that look like?
Thank you, Roger. I have a little factoid I want to share with you, and it's deeply frightening to me, so I'm going to share it with you. Maybe we'll share in our misery together. But this is a survey that was conducted recently, and all attribution to Heather Flanagan. I think she conducted it, or her organization did. And she stated in a webinar that I attended that Matthew so expertly moderated a few weeks ago. She stated that 47% of 250 librarians surveyed said that pirate sites are useful for learners. And I'm almost speechless, which is amazing in and of itself, but I'll just call that deeply problematic. And in other words, there are good use cases to use something like Sci-Hub or other shadow libraries. So let me just kind of break away from that just a moment. I think to answer the question more specifically, if we educate our users and hopefully mitigate these types of answers, librarians and end users alike, and we have good relationships with our central IT shops on our campuses or institutions, and if we employ two-factor authentication, and if we implement federated authentication, SAML-based authentication, I think these will go a long way to mitigating security risks and protecting patrons' privacy. And I think I've got just a moment here. We're getting up against time, but I did want to kind of expand on these concepts of federated authentication for a moment. And, I realize that there's a lot of institutions that still use Easy Proxy. I mean, I was one of them forever. I get it. I mean, I was around when Chris Zagar rolled it out into the public sphere, and you paid $350 and you had it forever. You didn't have to do annual subscriptions or anything like that. Shout out to OCLC. And it was a godsend when it occurred. And there are great implementations of Easy Proxy that are very secure, especially when they are SAML-based, which you can run Easy Proxy on SAML now. They integrate with the campus's single sign-on mechanisms and overall authentication systems, and this is in and of itself quite secure. I think where it gets less secure from an Easy Proxy standpoint is when we use IP addresses to authenticate users. And I'm going to shout out to Heather Flanagan again. She's probably one of the finest minds I've encountered in this space of authentication, which is complicated and it changes, it's ever evolving. And so I always kind of lean on her when I need information or want to steal from her. But I did reach out to her and say, I'm going to talk about you if it's all right. And she said, okay. But she states, and I agree with her, that federated identity and access management, to make the distinctions between authentication and authorization. Authentication answers the question, who are you? While authorization answers, what are you allowed to do? So authentication is the process of verifying the identity of a user, a system, or an entity, and it ensures that the person or system attempting to access a resource is who they claim to be. And authorization is the process of determining what an authenticated user is allowed to do. It defines permissions and access rights granted to a user or system after they have been authenticated. So there's a subtle distinction there. But in general and just writ large, I think federated access provides higher security because credentials are managed by the institution's identity system, and IP access, of course, and conversely relies on IP addresses. So that's in and of itself not a great indicator of a valid user, and it's less secure, and it can be, it's simpler to spoof.
Great. Thanks, John. Lots of great info there. We're going to just touch on some best practices, leave you with, and I know Matt wants to talk a little bit about some of the other initiatives and things happening. So just a couple of things, I think, from everyone's perspective, and I think this goes for libraries as well as content providers or vendors. I think we've touched on some of these things, enhancing the skills of your workforce around mitigating risk. I know at Cengage we have a number of contests around during Cybersecurity Awareness Month where we're trying to identify phishing emails that are artificially generated and those sorts of things, which I think just help engage our workforce and being more aware of their surroundings. I think we've talked a little bit about the red flags when working with vendors. I think these are things like whether it's a technology vendor that a publisher is working with or a library, just being aware of maybe shared data that's not by permission, right? Or perhaps unusual downloading or other things that you're noticing. And that usually should be regulated, and those conversations should be had with some of those vendors. And then I'll touch on privacy by design architecture, which is something our Cengage privacy and security team upholds. And this is looking at things like when you're building architecture and structure, it's really around things like intake questionnaires, where you're working with your security and privacy organizations to ensure that privacy concerns are identified and addressed, design reviews to scrutinize that architecture as it's being built, and then also limiting data sharing with third-party vendors to ensure that nothing is shared without that rights control or those requirements are in place. So that's, and I think we've touched on transparency and communication quite a bit. So with that, I did want to kick it to Matt to talk a little bit about the Scholarly Network Security Initiative. And Matt, do you want to share some things?
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Roger. And I know we're right up on time, so I'll make this brief, but shameless plug time for Scholarly Network Security Initiative. So this organization, of which John and I are members of, we're tasked with working together to combat the threat of cybercrime, protecting the integrity of the scholarly record. And it's a cross-stakeholder initiative that you have publishers, technology experts, libraries working together speaking about these issues. And I think that the University Relation Working Group, which again, John and I are a part of, we're largely tasked with winning the hearts and minds of really the library audience. And the way that we're doing that is raising awareness around these issues. That opening slide that Roger shared to kind of set the stage, that this is a very real risk, that libraries are on the front line. So we would like to try to convince institutions that they do have a role to play in this space. And we do that by sharing information, by speaking on panels, by creating infographics like this one sharing the slide, okay, on the upper left there. about what institutions can take away. And back, and I know that it's not an easy thing, that, relationships with, your respective IT departments aren't always seamless. But again, it's really about raising awareness and skill building and what libraries can do on their end, because it is a shared responsibility. And it's not just to protect the content that those providers host, but to protect your users and and their data. And I kind of view this session as more of like an appetizer or broad entry into the subject, but we do have 2 sessions. One later today, there's a poster session where you can learn about our toolkit, and hopefully things that you can literally take with you back to your institution. And tomorrow there's going to be a sponsored session about what exactly it is we're doing to work together to bridge this gap in the cybersecurity space. As well. I did not put the website there, and I see some of you taking pictures, but it's snsi.info, where you can learn more information, get this infographic, and the other tools that we have hosted there. Thank you.